Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 60 of the Build podcast. And in this episode, I thought of going through Gulp, which is a streaming build system. So before we go through Gulp, let's go through a little bit of prerequisites. The very first one is Package Manager. And in this case, we will be using NPM, which is a JavaScript node package manager. And so if you are not familiar with it, I highly recommend you to go through the links here, as well as there are many online tutorials on NPM. The second one is Grunt, which is another type of build system based on JavaScript as well. If you have not gone through any sort of build system, you can go through this, or maybe you can start with Gulp as well. So let's go through some of the websites related to Gulp. The very first one is gulpjs.com, and this is the home page of Gulp. It will basically tell you what's the efficiency, the ease of use, and ease of learning to pick up Gulp. And more importantly, if you look at their GitHub repository of gulpjs/gulp, if you look through the README file, this is exactly how you can get started really quickly. And of course, along with the GitHub repository, there is also an API documents which will go through more on the code for Gulp. And lastly, just like Grunt or other build systems, there are lots of plugins available for Gulp. For example, some of them that we will be using is minifying CSS or JavaScript. So for example, here you have Closure, or here you have Compressor, and tons of other plugins to play with. So let's get started with Gulp. The very first thing we'll do here, I am in a completely new directory, empty directory. So the very first thing we will do is npm init so that we can set up the package.json. So the name we will give is simply demo-gulp. Version can be using semantic versioning. We will just give point 1. Description is demo of Gulp. Entry point, it can be index.html. Test command none. Git repository none. Keywords demo, node, Gulp, and author, as well as license. Is this okay? Yep. And once you open up in the text editor, and there you'll see a package.json which will be updated as we add Gulp and more Gulp plugins. Great. So using npm, the very first thing we will do is install Gulp, and we will do a global installation of it. So with a -g as option. And once that's done, you can basically query the Gulp version. And yep, we are using 3.8.6. The local version is undefined, so why don't we install that? So to install it, we'll simply do npm install Gulp, and we will do --save dev. So what this will do is it will not only install the module in node modules folder, but it will also update package.json file. And there you go, we have installed it locally. So why don't we query Gulp version once again? And yep, we have local as well as the CLI version 3.8.6. So why don't we go ahead and check out our package.json? There you go, it is being added. So now that we have installed package.json, why don't we create our very first task? And to do that, I'll simply create a new file, and let's call it under the folder CSS, style.css. And inside here, let's just have a very simple style, which is body, and let's have it a background. And why don't we give it a background of cornflower blue? And also, just for a demo, let's have a margin of, say, simply 0. So our very the first task will be to simply minify this, which means to say it will all be in one line without all this new line, as well as the comment will be stripped off. So for this, let's go to the plugin page, and why don't we search for minify CSS? And there you go, this is something that we will use. So let's go ahead and check out its GitHub repository, and this will open up in the npm.js, and there are some simple instructions, and of course you can go ahead and check out the GitHub page as well. But very simply, why don't we go ahead and install it? So for that, it will be very simple, npm install --save dev, and then the Gulp minify CSS, the plugin name. So let's do that. And once it's installed, let's go ahead and check out package.json right here. And there you go, Gulp minify CSS has been added on. So let's go ahead and now create the Gulp file. So Gulp file is the file where we will define all our task and the build that we will be doing. So the very first thing we will do is define what is Gulp, and this will simply be requiring Gulp. And of course our very first task, which is minify CSS. And let's also require the plugin that we installed, which is gulp-minify-css. And next, let's define the task, which is called style, or any other task name you want to give. But for our purpose, we'll just define it as style. And as the second argument, it will be an anonymous function, and it will simply return Gulp, and then we will pipe on some stuff. So the very first thing will be .src, and this is where we will put in our source file, and our source file is simply from folder css style.css as we just created. Next, we will now define the task. So pipe in and minify CSS, which we just required above here. And finally, we also need a destination. So similarly, we'll do pipe, and then we will do gulp.dest. And we will maybe provide a folder, and for our purpose, we will simply call it assets. So why don't we try this out? So what will happen is we have this file here, and we will also have a new folder assets with the minified CSS version. So to execute this in our command line, all we need to do is simply gulp and then style, which is the task name. And there you go, it says that it's finished. And once we come back to our text editor, there you go, assets folder is created with style.css, which is completely minified. So now that we have our very first task, why don't we add on a second task? And that will be basically uglifying, or rather minifying, a JavaScript file. So for this, let's first create an index.html. And inside here, let's have a very basic structure. And let's link up the style sheet that we just created. It's under assets and then style.css. And just before ending, we will have the script with the source, and also assets/script.js, which is yet to be created. So why don't we go ahead and create a new file, in this case a JavaScript file, and that will be under JS and then script.js. So it will be really simple. Let's have a self-invoking anonymous function with a console log, and let's just say hello gulp. And why don't we try to dynamically add on the current date and time? So get element by ID, and it will have an ID of now, and then inner text equals to date. Something really simple. So now why don't we go ahead and install the plugin? So very similarly, we'll do npm install and gulp uglify and -- save dev to put it in the package.json as well. So there you go, gulp uglify has been installed. So let's check out the package.json. There you go, gulp uglify. And now why don't we go to the gulp file and add on another task. So for this, we will simply do uglify equals to require gulp-uglify. So similarly, why don't we define this task? So in this case, it will be gulp.task, and let's just give it a name, script in this case, and also the second argument as an anonymous function, and let's return gulp. In this case, let's choose the source file, which is inside the JavaScript script.js, and let's now pipe it to uglify, which is the name of the task, and finally the destination. So let's pipe it to gulp.destination, and simply it will be the assets folder once again. So right now, as you can see, the assets folder only has the style.css, and let's run the new task that we just created, which is gulp and then simply script. And there you go, it's been executed. And now when we come back and we open up script.js, there you go, it's just a one-liner with a minified, uglified JavaScript version. Now, wouldn't it be cool that you don't have to run all the tasks one by one? So for this, we can add on a big task. So that will call the style and the script task together. So for this, we will add on, which is gulp.task. And then let's just call it default. So default means when you just simply type gulp, it will run all these tasks. So the very first task it will run is style, and then it will run script. So why don't we try this out in the command line? So for simply, we'll do gulp, and there you go. It will run the style, it will run the script, and after that it will go ahead and create the two minified files. Why don't we add on one more plugin, and that is the delete file. So I would like to delete this entire folder before building the files once again. So for this we will use the delete plugin. So let's go ahead and install it first. This is npm install del, and once you go to package.json, yep, del is added on, and let's define the task. So we have style, script, so why don't we define del, maybe something alphabetical. So gulp dot task, and then let's call it delete, and function, and let's say del, and inside here we will call the folder which to delete, maybe assets, and then /star, which means to say all the files inside it, and then function. Let's pass in the error, and simply we will say console log files deleted. So why don't we try that out in the command line? So right now we do have the assets folder with the built files inside. So let's come to the command line and try gulp delete. Oops, del is not defined. So of course I need to define it. So let's go here and define it. Del equals to require. What is the name of the package? It is simply del. So I'll just say simply del. Let's run the task once again. Gulp delete. And it is deleted, and when we come back to our file text editor, yep, the assets folder is empty. So I'm going to come right at the bottom and add on delete as the very first task so that it deletes the previously built files, and then it continues on with the style and the script. So the cool thing about Gulp is under each task we can add on more plugin functions. So for example, before minify, or rather after minify, maybe you want to rename the file and add in a suffix, let's say .min. So why don't we add that on? So for that we will install another plugin which is called Gulp rename. So let's go to the command line and let's install it. And when we come back to the package.json, yep, Gulp rename is right here. So let's go to our gulp file, and right at the top, why don't we rename? We define rename, which is simply require gulp-rename. So in this case, what we will do, we will pipe in this task, because as part of the style, it will first minify it and then it will rename it. So we will do pipe and then rename. Let's add on a suffix, and the suffix will simply be .min. Why don't we do the same thing for the JavaScript? So after uglify, it will add on a suffix to the file. Alright, so why don't we try this out? So right now, as you can see, the assets is completely empty. And let's clear the command line and just run gulp. Oops, I probably have a spelling error on line 17. And yes, I did. Pipe, and line 25 as well. Let's run it once again. So it's simply gulp. Looks like it's successful. Let's come back to our text editor, and I have another spelling error. It should be suffix, and that's why it did not properly create the .min in the file name. So let's run this one more time. And now when we come back, there you go. With all our spelling mistakes gone, we have a script.min.js, which is a minified JavaScript file, and style.min.css, which is a minified style sheet. Now, whenever we are working in development, we will be changing a lot of things, and we don't really want to sort of come back and keep executing gulp in the command line. So a good way to do so is simply to have a watch function. So for this, the watch is built into gulp. So why don't we define it? So I'll come back right at the bottom. So let's define gulp.task. And let's call it watch so that it keeps watching the files for changes or saving the file. And we will simply have like about 2 tasks. The first task will be gulp.watch. Let's give it a path name. So for CSS, it will be css/style.css. And the name of the task is, as we defined, simply style. Why don't we add it on? But this time it will be for JavaScript. Script.js, and it will simply be script. Great, and now in our default gulp task, which is delete, then style and script, why don't we also run watch? Alright, so I'm gonna split the screen so that you can see what's happening. So let me start simply the gulp task, which will now not break because it will keep watching the file. So there you go, it will not break here. So why don't we come to script.js here, and instead of hello gulp, we will add on exclamation mark, and let's save it. And immediately you will see that only the script task is triggered because it detects that there is some change in the file. So let me break the watch task. The next thing we will do is try to simulate an error during the process of watching the file. So in this case, why don't we integrate JS hint, which will kind of hint the file and check for errors. So for that, we will install Gulp JS hint plugin. And there you go, JS hint is installed. And let's go to the Gulp file and define it. So we'll come here and say JS hint equals to require gulp-js hint. So let's go to the task script. So the cool thing about piping is just like a factory assembly line. We can say that, okay, so pipe uglify first, but before we rename it, let's have one more task, which is the JS hint task. So let's do a little JS hint on this. And that's it. That's all you need to do. And once you call gulp, it will also kind of watch the file. And of course, it will do the deleting, then the minification of style sheet, and the JavaScript, which will include uglification as well as JS hinting. So let's clear the command line. And I'm going to start gulp. And there you go. It's watching the file. So why don't I open up script.js? And there you go. So last time we added on some exclamation marks. So this time, why don't I purposely create some error? I'm just going to delete away the last line and save. Notice here, it will immediately break and the watch function breaks out. So obviously, in terms of development, we often come across errors in terms of hinting, linting, and other errors, but pipe function will break out of it. And this time we will add in plumber, which will help prevent the pipe from breaking. So for this, let's install gulp-plumber. All right, plumber is installed. Let's go to package.json. Yep, it's installed. So let's go to gulp file and let's define what is plumber first. So plumber equals to require gulp-plumber. And so after this, what we'll do is we'll insert the plumbing function, and we will do that right before uglifying. So let's do pipe and then simply plumber. And that's it, just one line. And of course, the gulp task will take care of the rest. So let's clear the screen and start gulp once again. And notice here, it already gives you an error, but it will never break out. So let's add it back, Command Z, and save it, and there you go, it just keeps on watching it. So why don't we purposely try to take out the first line and save it. Yep, it will give you the error, but it will never break out. So you can just continue coding and just watch in another screen all the errors. Great, so I hope this gave you a very brief introduction into what Gulp can do. I really love the short syntax and defining all the tasks together with the pipe syntax. Let's go through some of the resources that will be useful for learning Gulp. The very first link is actually found within the Gulp GitHub repository, and that is basically articles and recipes. I found this really useful to go through the various documentation, the API, the FAQ, and also some more articles that are contributed by the community. Next, there is also Gulp cheat sheet, and it's really beautifully done, and it kind of describes the path of creating the task. For example, the one I found useful was how to create parallel task and then async task and so on and so forth. The next one is Node School IO. So Gulp uses the syntax .pipe a lot, and that is part of Node. I felt going through the stream adventures, which is part of one module of Node School IO, helped me understand the pipe function very well. The next one is by Tuts Plus, which is managing your build task with Gulp.js, to go through this article by Ray. And there is, of course, Getting Started with Gulp by Mark. Very similar things installing, and he also goes through a lot of plugins that comes in handy. Next up is by Nitrous IO, which goes through how we can set up Gulp with live reloads, SaaS, and other tasks. Nitrous IO is a cloud IDE, so go ahead and try it out. And it's really easy to set it up with Nitrous. Next up is also another advanced article on Gulp file. And finally, for the build link of the episode, I will go with tagtree.tv. So I found this website that kind of makes really high quality video tutorials for web development. And there are, of course, a lot of them free, such as node streams, which will be very handy for learning Gulp. Or even there are also things like learning React.js. So, and of course, if you like it, you can also join it or even try out the free trial. And yeah, that's it for this week's episode of Gulp.js on Build Podcast. For the rest of the episodes, you can subscribe via RSS, iTunes, Vimeo, YouTube, GitHub, or Twitter, and just go to build-podcast.com for your content. Thank you and goodbye.